the reason the coup didn't work here is that they didn't have enough people and they didn't have enough weapons. And that's why Marjorie Taylor Greene, when she gave a speech to the Young Republicans party, and she said, if I'd organized the coup, there would have been more people and more weapons.
It's Ken Harbaugh with Burn the Boats on the MeidasTouch Network. Today, I've invited back on the show Dr. Ruth Ben-Ghiat, one of our nation's foremost experts on autocracy and dictators. She has been sounding the alarm about what is happening in America right now. The GOP, she warns, has been transformed into an autocratic party, and its media outlets are openly urging political violence. As just one case in point among many, Dr. Ben-Ghiat points to this clip from Fox News in which Greg Gutfeld defends the January 6th insurrectionists, calls for political violence, and attempts to convince viewers that elections are pointless.
But only certain people get criminal mulligans. And January 6 protesters, they don't get criminal mulligans. And here's why. They're the oppressor, right? So the oppressed get criminal mulligans. That this defiant refusal to reverse this decline argues against the survival of a country. What does that leave you with? It leaves you with you need to make war to bring peace, because you have a side that cannot change, because then that means an admission that their beliefs have been corrupt all the time. So in a way, you have to force them to surrender.
Or we could make love, not war.
I tried that once.
Or we have an election.
I had to go to a doctor.
Right. Elections. Yeah.
No, elections don't work. We know that. We know they don't work.
They do work.
Look what we have. Look what we have.
But
we had a moderate president, and we have crime exploding everywhere. We had a Democrat president promise that he was going to be moderate, promise that he was going to unite the country, and now we have a terrible education system. We have no border. We have crime everywhere. Every facet of society is in peril and in chaos because our elections don't matter.
My guest today is Ruth Ben-Ghiat, a historian who specializes in authoritarianism and propaganda. We had her on the show earlier this year, and I invited her back to get her take on how extremist groups and the former president himself are adapting to the prosecutions of the January 6th insurrectionists. Ruth, welcome back to Burn the Boats.
Thank you. Pleased to be here.
You remarked in a recent interview that although the number of hate groups in America may be declining, part of the reason is that they're consolidating. And in fact, membership in groups like the Proud Boys, well, the Proud Boys in particular, the group designated by our closest ally, Canada, as a terrorist entity, that membership is surging. And even more alarming is the way they are mainstreaming and putting forth political candidates, finding support among Republicans who are already elected. Can you tell us about, I can't think of a better word than the gentrification of these groups from street thugs to respectable members of the community and the historical parallels we should be worried about?
Yeah, gentrification is a great word, actually. To start straight off with a historical parallel, you know, I studied Italian fascism starting out and still do. And it's relevant that Italian fascism, I mean, the circumstances were very different after World War I, but it was a decentralized militia movement. Lots of veterans, so people who had, you know, weapons experience, and they were taking over town councils and beating up people in small towns and then in cities. So once, and they had their own kind of leaders, and then they all unified under Mussolini. And once Mussolini got into power, these thugs became his ministers. They became the ruling elite. They cleaned themselves up, but the violence continued under a different auspice. So it's very disturbing to me to see this kind of fusion of some parts of the GOP and extremist groups. We'll talk about the Proud Boys in a second, but the Oath Keepers, which are they're not surging the way the Proud Boys are, but there are long-standing relationships between state and local GOP lawmakers and groups like the Oath Keepers. And there was a 2022 study, and the Washington Post talked about it, that said 1 in 5 state and local GOP lawmakers either had some ties or some sympathies to groups like Three Percenters and Oath Keepers and Proud Boys. So this is a meeting of extremists who are being mainstream gentrified with the GOP, which is ready to become more extremist, especially it's been radicalized after January 6th.
And the fact that, at least in terms of numbers, they can still be considered marginal groups shouldn't be a great reassurance to us, because if we go back to your Italian analog, I mean, when Mussolini marched on Rome with his 30,000 black shirts, that did not seem like a massive movement. They were massively outnumbered, even by the Italian military, which could have crushed them, but Mussolini ascended.
Yeah, and it's important that it's very sad and important that you bring that up, because the king, who was one of the people who invited Mussolini in after the March on Rome, which was a kind of a soft coup, they didn't need to like assault any buildings because they invited out of fear. But the king was the commander in chief. And so he had the entire Italian army and armed forces at his disposal against these 30,000 squadrists, but he didn't do anything. And so that's a very deep lesson that I think about all the time.
The typical story of the ascendance of that kind of autocrat, Adolf Hitler, Mussolini, others in that same vein, is that they came up from the bottom through the ranks. Our story is a little bit different in that we have this bottom-up grassroots movement, but it's being empowered by a very top-down megaphone and infrastructure, starting with the former president himself. How do you think about those parallels and where they diverge? In some ways, it's even more dangerous in that their
totally.
guy. Yeah, go ahead.
No, it's what can happen is that somebody like, a strongman Trump comes in, and a lot of his lines, actually, like taking back the country, come from the Tea Party, an already kind of radicalized, wing of the Republican Party. But what Trump did is that he immediately started signaling during his first campaign, 2016, he was signaling to all extremists and all racists of every sort in America to create like a big tent for all of them. And so, there's like in February 2016, he was there was a study, 62% of what he was retweeting was white nationalist propaganda. And then one of the biggest red flags, but a good thing if you're a neo-Nazi or whatever, is when he said he could stand on Fifth Avenue and shoot someone and he wouldn't lose any followers. Who are the followers who would like it if he shot someone? It's extremists, the Proud Boys. So we've had 7 years of this stuff. And no wonder they feel very empowered. And so the Proud Boys in particular, they and also Oath Keepers were used not only by Trump, but by GOP lawmakers as security at rallies. And we have to realize that Trump's rallies, but also those of Matt Gaetz and others, they are radicalization events, and they've been like that for some years. So Trump uses his rallies, that's why journalists have to be very careful the way they cover them, to radicalize people. And so you have either as attendees or as security, you have extremists like the Proud Boys there, and their purpose is to create, more bodies for the cause. And that's how you also got to January 6th. So unfortunately, when you have somebody, the sitting president of the United States calling neo-Nazis very fine people, I'm sure they never expected, those thugs who went to Charlottesville never expected a president of the United States to call them very fine people. That is indeed a whole different story, and much more difficult to defeat in a way.
The historical echoes of that are inescapable, but please make them clear to our viewers. When you talk about extremists providing security at radicalization events, I immediately picture rallies in Berlin. I immediately picture rallies in Rome in the 30s. Can you talk about the Nazis and the fascists' strategy of using security to help accelerate the radicalization among their less committed followers?
Yeah, I could believe that when I read this, when I learned this, that they'd been using, that Trump and other people had been using them as security, because the very first squad, because of the Italian fascists, the black shirts were called the squadras. And that's because they were different militias, right? Squads. The very first one was created, of course, by Mussolini, and it came out of his bodyguards. So his private security. And then that was, you could say, the core of the whole fascist movement in a way. And so I mentioned this fact that because they've become, if you look at this from the perspective of other countries too, these groups have functioned as a de facto kind of paramilitary, like a paramilitary wing of the Republican Party. And the thing that, because we only have these two giant parties, there are many worlds inside the Republican Party. But I do see all of these people, even before January 6th, I saw them as a de facto paramilitary. And that's the role they played for Trump. And one very interesting fact is, in the 21st century, because I study coups, and a third of the book is about coups, and I wrote it before January 6th. I didn't expect to be applying it here. But the new playbook for insurrection seems to be, if you can't get the military to collaborate with you, you have an already radicalized civilian army that you have cultivated for years. And then you incite these people to, to do violence on your behalf. And so it wasn't just Trump who did this. It was Bolsonaro in Brazil. He had a bunch of people, they were camped out for months. And then they went and, did very similar things to January 6th. It was January 8th. But very different outcome. Bolsonaro is now banned from politics in Brazil until 2030. And that's actually how you treat these people. You have to take them out and make them non-viable as candidates. And that starts to kind of, they lose their luster.
Well, let's talk more about the military, because you have this incredible piece in The Atlantic. We'll put a link to that in the show notes, with some really important observations. But at the heart of it is the idea that Pinochet had the military and the power of that behind his tyrannical rule, and that seems to have been a lesson taken to heart by those who study coups and autocracies, that if you don't have the military, you're not going to succeed. But there seems to be a different mode these days. If you can co-opt a political party, if you can do an end run around the military, how do you think about the evolution of the coup away from a military takeover to something softer and more political?
Yeah, I don't know what will happen in the future with these other kinds of insurrections, but it's very interesting to me, especially in the United States, which has one of the largest and most powerful militaries in the world. But, all it takes is a few people, like, Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Milley, and those around him were extremely, they're pro-democracy people. They didn't want the Constitution and their oath to be violated, and they stood up and they blocked this because Trump was trying to cultivate the military. And now we have Michael Flynn, who's very, very busy trying to radicalize the military ever since, and he was very involved. He wanted to declare martial law and rerun the election under military. And there's a part of the military and security apparatus, as it's called in other countries, that is radicalized. And I can only hope that there's been more vetting of extremists in the ranks of all of these bodies than I've heard about publicly, because this is the line. The reason the coup didn't work here is that they didn't have enough people and they didn't have enough weapons. And that's why Marjorie Taylor Greene, when she gave a speech to the Young Republicans party, and she said, if I'd organized the coup, there would have been more people and more weapons.
I remember that speech and how easily it was dismissed by her colleagues on the right, but just how chilling it was for the rest of us. I think one of the takeaways for me, back to the question about the political approach, is that if you can co-opt a political party to undermine the Constitution, you don't actually need to fire a shot. You don't need to physically occupy buildings, a Capitol building, for example, with insurrectionists. You just send your party in.
Yeah, and then that party, though, is also working very actively, and this just infuriates me as a first-generation American. My father was an immigrant and a defense subcontractor. That Tommy Tuberville is working actively to sabotage the U.S. military by holding up all the promotions, and not just sabotaging the military domestically, so they're not as ready for whatever they would need to be doing, but abroad. And so the GOP it knows what it's doing. There's a kind of, if you link all the pieces up of what they're doing, there's a design to kind of weaken America from within and degrade its democracy and transform it into something else.
You said that if Trump gets back into power, he will never leave. How would that look in practice? How would he either change the law or deploy his personal militia to never leave?
Yeah, I don't know exactly. There are many paths to doing that. You call states of emergency. That's the most likely thing. You invent, which is what we know that various people around him and him hoped would happen. You try and provoke civil unrest, and then you have the quote excuse to crack down. Or you declare an emergency at the border, excuse for martial, for kind of even, like regional martial law, states of emergency. You do things like that. Also, the new way is that's electoral autocracy. You try, and he tried this in November 2020. You don't get rid of elections, but you fix them. You fix the whole system. And it's going on in Wisconsin. It's all, it's being done at the state level, so that it's harder for people to vote, and then their vote isn't really counted. And this is why the GOP is always sitting at the feet of Viktor Orban in Hungary, because he has mastered electoral autocracy. So you hold elections, but the opposition can never, even if it all bands together, like the last election in Hungary, they had 6 parties in the coalition, but they couldn't be heard by the media because the media was already domesticated by Orban, and he'd already purged the judiciary and all the electoral machinery. So even if there were challenges to his win, they would not be received. Trump has learned from his failures. You had 62 judges, many of them appointed by him, who turned back his challenges in 2020. So they're all working. He's got people working on various projects to make sure that never happens again.
I am sure you're familiar with the Stalin quote, probably apocryphal, when he said he doesn't care who votes or how, he just cares who counts the votes and how. That seems to be what you're describing. That's
why Jack Smith, when he announced the first indictment, he ended his very beautiful speech saying, I'm paraphrasing, that It's not about only the right to vote, it's the right to have your vote counted.
Right. When you look at Trump's ability to consolidate all of these extremist organizations and the adjacent organizations to build enough of a coalition to get him just over the line with the Electoral College, do you think that's a strategic positioning on his part, or is it just an instinctive thing when he says, I could shoot someone in the middle of Fifth Avenue and I wouldn't be held accountable? Do you think he is consciously talking to those extremists who love that projection of violence, or is it just who he is and his aptitude is not thoughtful, it's just natural?
It's both. It is who he is, but who he is one of the most superb propagandists of the 21st century. He's been brilliant at saying the right things to the right people, saying them over and over again. Everything he does is designed to increase his own power and people's devotion to him, or threaten people. Also, he's had a campaign, and this is very relevant to increasing extremism. Since 2015, he chose, it's a choice he's making, to use his rallies as ways to change how people think about violence. This is part of radicalization. Over and over again. And in my report to the January 6th committee, I had a long list of, it was only a partial list, but it was still a long list of all the rallies and all the quotes. So he would start saying in like 2015, in the old days, people would be carried out in a stretcher, but you can't do that anymore. Or in 2016, he said, the problem is today people don't want to hurt each other anymore. So it's a problem when people are not violent to each other. So you do this for 7 years and you get a meeting of sympathies and meeting of the minds with extremists, because extremists believe that only violence is the way to change history. And who is saying that out loud today? Many of them. Matt Gaetz recently, he goes to the Iowa State Fair. And anywhere is radicalization site now. So here's people munching on their corn dogs. They've got their 4-year-old, in diapers or whatever, kids in diapers, toddlers. And Matt Gaetz stands there with Trump and says, only force can bring change to Washington, D.C. Okay. What does that mean? It means we're no longer into democratic reform. We're no longer into legislation or elections changing things. It's only force. It's violence. So everyone's there munching on their corn dogs, listening to this. And so this is what they're doing. And Trump has created an environment by his own similar comments where they feel that this is how to get ahead in the Republican Party, is to speak this way.
And Trump was at Matt Gaetz's shoulder when he said that. We did a piece on that right after it happened.
Yeah.
You touch on this in your Atlantic piece when you talk about the longer game, the fact that there's going to be a sunset on this coalition, on this kind of rhetoric, because, quoting you, the Republicans are so out of step with popular desires, things can only go one way for them. My fear is in how long that will take. Mm-hmm. And I think your conclusion is that if we don't stop them between now and 2024, we might not have another chance, but you still hold out enormous hope. The overall tone of your Atlantic piece is hopeful. You elevate hope as the antidote to Trumpism. How much assurance should we take from that, given that we have it feels like one last chance?
Yeah, I mean, this is the Atlantic piece, the one on Chile, I assume you're talking about. It took a long time for Chileans to get their democracy back, but it started with them, and this was a horrible, military dictatorship that tortured thousands of people. So it's the worst possible circumstance for people to start coming out into the streets. But they did. in the early 80s. Now, it took them until the end of the 80s to get their democracy back, but it's so inspiring because they had the courage to have, it was called a March for Joy. And the whole message, they had a chance to vote Pinochet out, which we don't have time to explain how that happened, but it's very rare. So they took this window of opportunity, and it was the power of positive messaging. And they had to convince a population that was terrified. Everybody knew someone who'd been disappeared or tortured. I mean, horrible stuff, and was traumatized. So you have a nation that's traumatized, and somehow they were able to go out and feel hope and feel optimism. And there were all these messages, TV ads that talked about, joy is coming. The slogan was joy is coming. So it's very moving. That's why I wrote about it. And we're in far better circumstances. Like, we should be out there doing, joy is coming, because Trump has also been trying with psychological warfare to make us believe that there is no out, that he's the inevitable, that he's the savior. And also just to rob people of their idealism, except if it's attached to him. So there are a lot of lessons to be taken from that. And one of them is to use the windows that you're given. And we have this time now, and we have got to use it, or I don't know what will happen, but it's not going to be good.
Thanks for watching, everyone. We've got a quick message from our show sponsor, but first, I've got a favor to ask. Growing a show like Burn the Boats depends on you. There was a time when thoughtful interviews with interesting guests could stand on their own, but these days, the algorithm is everything. The recommendations that show up in the feeds of YouTube viewers and podcast listeners depend on the reviews that shows like this get. So please give us a thumbs up, follow this channel, and if you're up for it, please consider clicking on the link to the podcast page and leaving us a 5-star review. It makes a huge difference. Thanks. I hate wasting food. We cook a lot at home, and in the past, we threw out so many scraps, peels, leftovers, even old coffee grounds. Now, nothing is wasted thanks to Lomi. It has changed the way I think about my food waste. Lomi transforms my trash into treasure at the push of a button. Lomi is a countertop electric composter that turns food scraps to plant food in 4 hours. There's no food rotting in my garbage and smelling up the kitchen. Now, I only take the trash out on garbage day, plus no more leaky bags. I turn my waste into nutrient-rich, loamy earth that I can feed to my plants, lawn, or garden instead of sending it to the landfill. It can help the environment and make my life easier. All my food scraps, plant clippings, even those leftovers I forgot in the back of the fridge can go back into my garden, helping me grow more nutritious food at home. And now, Lomi's new app lets me track my environmental impact, earn points for every cycle, and redeem for freebies from Lomi and other great brands. It feels great to know that I'm creating loamy earth instead of waste. I have a basically limitless supply of plant food for my garden, plus I'm helping save the planet. Whether you want to start making a positive environmental impact or just grow a beautiful garden, Lomi is the perfect way to start. Head to lomi.com/boats and use the promo code BOATS to get $50 off your Lomi. That's $50 off when you head to lomi.com/boats and use promo code BOATS at checkout. Thank you, Lomi, for sponsoring this episode. Cold turkey may be great on sandwiches, but there's a better way to break your bad habits. We're not talking about some weird mind trick from your wacky neighbor or some sketchy message board. We're talking about our sponsor, Fume, and they look at the problem in a different way. Not everything in a bad habit is wrong. So instead of a drastic, uncomfortable change, why not just remove the bad from your habit? Fume is an innovative, award-nominated device that does just that. Instead of electronics, Fume is completely natural. Instead of vapor, Fume uses flavored air. And instead of harmful chemicals, Fume uses all natural flavors. You get it. Instead of bad, Fume is good. It's a habit you're free to enjoy and makes replacing your bad habit easy. Your Fume comes with an adjustable airflow dial and is designed with movable parts and magnets for fidgeting, giving your fingers a lot to do, which is helpful for de-stressing and anxiety while breaking your bad habit. The first time I used Fume, I was surprised at how it's so easy to hold and perfectly balanced, and quite honestly fun to fidget with. The real wood material and sleek design definitely classes it up. Stopping is something we all put off because it's hard, but switching to Fume is easy, enjoyable, and even fun. Fume has served over 100,000 customers and has thousands of success stories, and there's no reason that can't be you. Join Fume in accelerating humanity's breakup from destructive habits by picking up the Journey Pack today. Head to tryfume.com and use code BOATS to save 10% off when you get the Journey Pack today. That's tryfum.com and use code BOATS to save an additional 10% off your order today. Hi, Burn the Boats fans. I want to take a quick break to talk about our sponsor for today's show, Rhone. Men's closets are long overdue for a radical reinvention, and Rhone has stepped up to the challenge. Rhone's commuter collection represents the most comfortable, breathable, and flexible clothes I've ever found. Rhone makes it so easy to get ready for any occasion. The commuter collection offers the world's most comfortable pants, dress shirts, quarter zips, and polos. Rhone's comfortable 4-way stretch fabric provides breathability and flexibility that leaves you free to enjoy whatever life throws your way, from your commute to work to weekends at the kids' ball games. Looking good is easy with Rhone's wrinkle release technology, which makes wrinkles magically disappear, seriously, as you wear the products. It's really that easy. I don't have time between work and family and everything in between to worry about dry cleaning or ironing. With Rhone, I don't have to. I just wear and go. And I feel great doing it. Even after a long day, Rhone feels clean and new and just as comfortable as the moment I put it on. You got to try it out. Head to rhone.com/boats and use promo code BOATS to save 20% off your entire order. That's 20% off your entire order when you head to rhone.com/boats and use code BOATS. Trust me, Rhone makes choosing what to wear not just easy, but classy and comfortable. That's rhone.com/boats. I'm very curious about the circumstances, the environment that nurtures and creates autocrats, because a lot of it is cultural. And when I read your profiles of Mussolini, when I read your descriptions of Pinochet, it actually made me think. This is going to sound strange, but I just finished reading another biography of Churchill, The Splendid and the Vile. I suspect you've read it, and the similarities are striking, except that Churchill had a different cultural environment. He had different schooling, but personality-wise, he had all the hallmarks of an autocrat, but it was channeled in a very different way. How powerful is culture in shaping those autocratic tendencies versus personal ambition?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. And if you look at like the biographies of a lot of these guys, there are lots of differences, but one thing they have in common is they are opportunists, and they have no moral code. So they take opportunities and they see things for their own self-advancement and power, and they will do things that other people wouldn't do. And there is no limit or bottom for these people. Now, it's important that many of them were already criminals when they came into power or were running for office. So it's not just Trump who's running for the third time for office, having investigations over his head. Mussolini and Hitler had criminal records. Putin was under investigation. Berlusconi was under investigation, had so many corruption charges against him. So
Stalin
they're
was an
already
enforcer.
yeah. So many of them already were lawless, dangerous criminals, and this is what attracted people to them. But that shows that their personality profile is that there's nothing they won't do, and they also specialize in letting having people become their worst selves. So they get these elites. I have a piece in my Lucid newsletter about Mark Meadows as an example of a political elite who's was already very right wing. He used to go around in 2012 saying, Obama isn't really American. We got to take back the country. But he was driven to glue himself onto Trump, thinking that he would, by saving Trump, he'd save himself. And by serving Trump, you become debased. The goal of people like Trump or Mussolini is to debase everyone around them and lead them to do things they never thought possible. Because these guys specialize in having a vision of changing the country in ways that make lawlessness the law of the land. And so you end up with genocides, you end up with coups, you end up with torture, and it all becomes normalized. So that's when we go back to our theme of extremists, when extremists become normalized. When Proud Boys are sitting on the executive council, Republican executive council in Miami-Dade, those chairs are occupied by people who believe in violence, and they kind of corrupt everybody around them. So that's the problem.
I think that's the soft coup I'm most worried about. It's the realization among the extremist groups that they can do it the old-fashioned way. They can get enough followers and enough votes through intimidation and gerrymandering that they don't need to carry torches. They can work their way up, starting with school boards and city council seats, and pretty soon you have Oath Keepers running for governor in Pennsylvania and Proud Boy sympathizers in Congress. And look, you don't have to go to jail doing it that way.
Yeah, we already have that. Mark Fincham, he didn't win, but so people are like, well, so what? He didn't win. No, the point is that the guy is a self-proclaimed proud Oath Keeper, and despite that, and I would say because of that, he was nominated to be Secretary of State candidate. So it's already happened. The fact he didn't win is that the voters had decided they didn't want somebody like that, but the party wanted somebody like that. And there are many other, the Oath Keepers, there's somebody in Wisconsin who, they're all over the place. So it's already happened that the values of the Republican Party have become the values of autocratic parties. And a lot of people don't want to hear that, or it seems exaggerated. But it is now a functioning autocratic party with a kind of paramilitary. It's scary.
Do you think they have reached a tipping point? I recall the 2008 postmortem when they looked at how badly they lost and assessed as a party that they needed to create a bigger tent. They needed to be more welcoming. That has been entirely rejected. The strategy is entirely focusing on high turnout among their most radical supporters. But implicit in that strategy is the idea that minoritarian rule will be necessary. If you're not appealing to more voters, you're just radicalizing and intensifying the participation of your core voters. You're going to have to rule the areas where you win, and if you win a presidential, you're going to have to rule the country with a minority of the public supporting you. At which point is that their only path, because they have so alienated the middle that they'll never reach a majority again. And depending on your answer to that, is the answer the obsolescence of the Republican Party, or a party that's so extreme it looks like Sunni rule in Iraq or something like that?
Yeah, so the plan would be that you could say that some of them don't care if they're out of step with the voters, because the plan of electoral autocracy is that voting doesn't matter as much. Remember, 1/3 of the House is election deniers on the Republican side. 1/3 of sitting people in the House deny elections, which is an act of corruption, as well as, it's not just that a belief you're choosing to have. It's you're saying you're not going to leave office. You don't think that politics should be decided by elections. So the more you invest, and the Republican Party is now a party that is dependent on lies, on the threat of violence or actual violence and corruption that's what it is now. So if you're like that, you don't care as much about how people are going to vote, because your plan is to fix the voting system so you don't have to care. And then you can be as extreme as possible. And one very haunting thing, so Mussolini, he's better than Hitler as a comparison. I don't like to, it's not really a comparison, but as an example, a historical example, because he was a prime minister of a democracy for 3 years, and then he had a crisis because he ordered a hit job on someone, and he declared dictatorship to save himself because he was going to probably have to go to jail. Very contemporary. In his speech announcing dictatorship, he said, if fascism has been a criminal organization, well, I'm the head of that organization. So he's like, yeah, we did it. We did all the violence, and now I'm the head, and that's too bad. So that was an extreme example of saying, we don't care if you hate me, if you can't vote me out anymore. And that's dictatorship now. That's old school. So today, a party says, yeah, we don't have to care if we're way out of step on abortion or gun rights, because we're not interested. We're not going to be depending on voting as much anymore. We're going to be using trickery and violence and all these other things.
Well, I live in Ohio, where the Republicans in the House have mastered the art of trickery and kicking the can down the road and redrawing maps and defying the state Supreme Court. And my minoritarian rule is coming. You mentioned that a third of the House are election deniers. I think a lot of them, and there's documentation for this, will say privately that they know better. My question for you is, does it even matter if they know better when you judge their actions by their outcomes? I'm thinking in particular of Romney's conversations with all of his peers in the Senate. These observations are just coming out now, and he claims that almost every one of those Republican senators, bar a couple, absolutely know that what they're doing is wrong. But my contention now is that doesn't matter. That doesn't matter, because the end result are these anti-democratic impulses given fuel and taking over their party.
Yeah, it doesn't matter. And the same with Tucker Carlson, who, that all that stuff came out where they hate Trump. They know very well, what went on in 2020, and it actually just highlights the corruption and the authoritarian designs that all these people have. So it doesn't matter what they believe, because belief is no longer, there's no principles or morals anymore. It's just the ends justify the means, and the end is to get to power and not have to leave. And no matter what happens to the country, no matter how many deaths you cause, that's all they care about. That's why another reason I call them an autocratic party.
A lot of their grip on power depends on either their followers not caring as well, or them getting their information from such stovepiped channels that they never hear that Donald Trump, or that J.D. Vance compared Donald Trump to Hitler. Do you think the problem on the right amongst voters is a lack of information, or antipathy towards the left?
I think it's a little of both, and it's all part of the same thing, because right-wing propaganda and Fox, including Fox News, of course, and all that ecosystem has been successful in getting people to think that they are existentially threatened by Biden that he's taking their rights away. I call this the upside down world of authoritarianism. So it's Biden who's the authoritarian. It's scientists public health scientists who want us to not be diseased. They're the enemy. And so that's part of it, that they've been extraordinarily focused. They've had unified messaging. That's another sign that they're authoritarian. So there's that. And then there's, the cult part of this, where recently there was a study came out that said that, the core of Trump supporters, they believe him more than they believe their friends or family. And so I thought, I feel vindicated, because there are times when I'll talk about Trump having a leader cult and people think it's just way exaggerated. But that is the definition of cult devotion, when you believe them more than people you used to trust. And that may shrink, although every time he has an indictment, because he's got this victimhood script, he's able to be more popular. And the other part of the reason he becomes more popular is that none of the other candidates, not only they're not allowed to thrive, they were made, talk about authoritarian spectacle, during that very scandalous debate. They were made to raise their hands on stage and pledge loyalty to him, even if he becomes a convicted criminal. It's like, where do you go with a party if you've reached that point, where the other candidates have to take their own power away and debase themselves by saying, I'm running for office, but I'm going to be loyal to, der Führer, Trump, even if he becomes a criminal. That's a party that is in crisis, you could say.
I remember reading those polling results. It wasn't just people trusting Trump more than their aunts and uncles. It was immediate family members, their priests.
Yep.
It was, as cultish as it gets. It makes me wonder, is liberalism, lowercase L, up to the task? One of the strengths of democracy, and you see this in the Democratic Party on the left, this cacophony of voices and opinions, is also an inherent weakness when confronting a movement that has, as you just observed, a unified message. How does liberalism fight back against that?
Yeah, that's a problem, right? Because it's not in the nature of, and the Democratic Party, if we just reduce it to the Democratic Party now here, it's not gonna have a unified message, nor are there enforcers like Tucker Carlson. If you say the wrong thing about an issue, you're going to be hauled up, on TV, like Tucker Carlson did to Ted Cruz, when Ted Cruz made the mistake of saying January 6th was a domestic terror event. And like the next day, Tucker had him on and totally humiliated him. And that was a lesson. Democrats don't do those things. And so it's very difficult to have your message spread effectively. So we're kind of disadvantaged. But we have taken, of course, not only our institutions and checks and balances for granted, but also we need to kind of take a lesson from actually authoritarians' very savvy use of emotion. Now, Trump, it's in Trump's case, and also Erdogan in Turkey, it's fake. They just want to use and manipulate these people. But Trump tells his followers that he loves them. And he actually talks about emotion a lot. He always has. And so they bond to him and they feel hopeful and they feel like they're doing something together. So this is like he built a movement making people feel their destiny could be fused with his destiny. And, liberals, it's not the kind of thing they do. They don't use like emotion in this way. But we need to kind of update all of that stuff. Also, the way that, like, if you think of, we're such an image-based culture, and young voters, they're all on TikTok or they're, on Instagram. And the right has, also used images and graphic design often more effectively. So did the communists, the historic communists. very strong symbols. We have the Statue of Liberty, but we don't use the whole arsenal of things that we could to get people excited about democracy. And that's what's lacking, and we really need that now.
It's that appeal to emotion that Trump is so good at, that makes me wonder how this ends. I'm sure you've seen the comment coming from the right that there's no way Biden could have gotten 70 million plus votes because he's never seen a Biden flag, whereas Trump flags are everywhere. I think that's the difference between being in a cult and not being in a cult. But that type of emotional connection to a movement never ends well when it falls apart.
No, and as we saw on January 6th, when the leader is in distress and there's a risk of the whole thing falling apart, or there's defeat, the followers, the most extremist, devoted ones, become very volatile, because he's convinced them that, he said on January 6th, if we don't fight, we're not going to have a country anymore. It's like me or the abyss, me or the apocalypse. And so they get very agitated and volatile, and they can be manipulated. So we could, it's not pretty, the things that can happen even if they're being defeated. The interim is difficult.
Well, I want to end on a hopeful note. You have this line in your Atlantic piece: "We will get through this, and our democracy will be strengthened as a result." I believe that as well. I don't see the exact path, but I know how invested my community is, my neighbors are, my circle of friends are in beating back this threat to our democracy, and I think we'll be stronger afterwards as a result of having gone through it.
We will, and the positive story that we don't hear is the world is in the middle of a total renaissance of mass protest. And we have the biggest in history. Was first the Women's March, surpassed then 3 years later by Black Lives Matter, which involved up to 20 million people in America. And it was multi-generational and multiracial. And then all the things happening in the state houses. Look at Tennessee. There's new alliances being born. There's a lot of stuff going on in our country, just to stick with it, that people have been sensitized to the danger in a new way, and they're kind of waking up, or have already been awake and are trying new methods. So it's not easy, but the path is there, and the more we can come together, and both for practical reasons like cross mobilization, like in the Women's March was successful because it was 100 different organizations came together. We got to do that. But also feeling that you're not alone in this struggle is really important.
Well, let's end with that hopeful coda. Ruth, it's been great, as always, having you on. Thank you so much.
It's a pleasure.
Hey Meidas Mighty, love this report? Continue the conversation by following us on Instagram @MeidasTouch to keep up with the most important news of the day. What are you waiting for? Follow us now.